How you doing, Henry? Yeah, Henry, I'm really excited to have you as my driver. You know, I'm one of the only superintendents in the state of Michigan that actually gets a driver. I think you're going to enjoy what you're about to see. Chippewa Valley CTE Auto Tech program had the opportunity to listen to Michigan lemon law lawyer Steve Lehto. Steve has been practicing law for over 30 years, but that's not all Steve does. He has written several award-winning books on historical topics. Steve has his own YouTube channel, Lehto's Law, with 250,000 subscribers. Here he discusses everyday topics that have legal ramifications. During his presentation, Steve conveys a message that no one should limit themselves to one career path. A student should not keep blinders on when building their future. What wonderful advice given to our students. Hope you find Steve's presentation as fascinating as I did. We got about 3 hours, Henry, before we got to be there, so I'll tell you what. That would be just about the right amount of time for us to head over to Chick-fil-A, get in line, and get ourselves a chicken sandwich. Now we're going to learn about Chrysler's efforts to build a car with a turbine engine. Just imagine, a plane engine in your car in the 1960s, all from Chrysler.
The other car on the top row of the first slide I showed you is a Chrysler Turbine car. And what we're talking about is the idea that you put a jet engine in a car. So you guys are very familiar with piston technology. You're becoming more aware of electric motor technology, but jet technology. And a lot of people are unaware of the fact that jets, the actual planes that fly under turbine propulsion, were around at the beginning of World War II. The Germans put a jet aircraft into the air in 1938. And we had jet aircraft by the end of the war, so did the British. And so when the war ended, people were wondering, what can we do with this wonderful new technology of turbine power? And so Chrysler had a couple very, very brilliant engineers who said, you know, I bet we can shoehorn one into a car. And so on the far right's a guy named Hubner, the guy grinning with the suit. And then this guy here is worthy of note. The man in the suit right there with his hand on the fender is Dr. Sam Williams. And there's a business in Michigan called Williams International, founded by him. Originally it's called Williams Research. Before he founded that company, he worked at Chrysler, and he was the guy who said, we can put a jet engine into a car. This photograph was taken in 1953. That is a jet engine being lowered into a Chrysler product, and that would, in fact, run. For those of you who are not 100% familiar with how this would work in a car, you basically have a gas generator power stage on the turbine, so the air comes in this end. It then gets compressed into a combustion chamber where it catches fire, and then the exhaust blasts out past that second fan disc, which causes it to spin, which then in turn spins the compressor, which is pulling the air into this. And then as the exhaust gases blast out of here, they then blast over another turbine wheel, which is then connected by a series of gears into the output shaft that goes into the transmission. So the turbine might spin at, say, 50,000 RPM or 40,000 RPM. That's a little bit too fast to put to the rear wheels of your car, so you do a reduction gear of about 10 to 1. That's 10.89 to 1, but 10 to 1 is the figure you always hear. And the turbine engine actually has some huge advantages over a piston engine. Among other things, it has fewer moving parts. It's simpler. It also spins instead of reciprocates. So think of a piston going back and forth over on one side of the V and going back and forth on the other side of the V. That's why engines shake. Okay? Now, I understand a smooth running engine doesn't shake, but there are things going back and forth. It's a lot of wasted energy if you think about it. The piston goes to the top, it's got to reverse, go back down to the bottom, reverse, go back up to the top. By spinning, you're being more efficient with the energy, but also it runs smoother. But the real key is that a turbine engine will run on anything that burns. You can run it on gasoline, kerosene, diesel, alcohol, VO5 hairspray, Chanel No. 5, tequila. Anything that burns, you can put in a turbine engine. So there are a bunch of advantages to this, and the thought was if we can downsize one and fit it in a car, we can sell possibly turbine-powered cars in Detroit. So this right here is a part cutaway of the later turbine engines that Chrysler built. That big thing on the side is the exhaust, and there's the compressor, there's the power turbine, and so on. And if you see this, when you pop the hood on one of these cars, it actually looks like one of those old anti-submarine mines from World War I. It's like a cast iron ball. But they did that because if a turbine ever has a problem where one of the blades comes off, they shoot off at a high rate of speed. And blade separation will often poke holes in buildings if it happens indoors, and they'll often go like, a couple hundred yards down the road if it happens outdoors. And also it could hurt you if it happened. I interviewed a couple guys who developed these engines, and they would take this disc here, the third of the discs there, and they would put it in a thing called a spin pit. And there's a building on Greenfield where they did this, where they actually dig a hole in the ground, and they line it with cement, and they line it with lead. And then they put a thing at the top where they can run a shaft through, and they can put the disc on there, and they can spin it up to 100,000 RPM. They're planning on running these things at 50, 60 maybe. So 100,000 RPM. And then they put a high-speed camera in the pit looking down at the disc. And the second that the disc wobbles, it takes a high-speed photograph. And the guy told me that they would run those up to 100,000 RPM and let them run until something broke, because they wanted to see how durable they were. And he said that you could be at the other end of the building wearing those heavy-duty headphones, and you knew it happened because you felt it vibrate through the floor. And that's a blade that weighs probably less than an ounce coming off at that high rate of speed. And he said that they'd get the photograph, they'd look at the photograph, and he goes, and they'd look, and there'd be a big hole punched in the lead where it hit the lead with such force that it causes the lead to splash. So there's a lot of energy in these engines. The trick is to get it out efficiently and to make it marketable and easily usable in a commercial setting. So this is about 1953. This is the first Chrysler turbine car being revealed to the public. And these guys figured out also, just the way Tucker did and the way Elon Musk later would, that anytime you've got something really cool, you can often announce it to the press, and they'll show up, and you'll get free publicity. So these are the press people here. At the wheel is George Huebner, the guy who's the head of the program. Sitting in the back seat, passenger side, is Dr. Williams, going for a ride in the turbine car. And I should mention to you that Dr. Williams was blind. Dr. Williams was blind ever since he was a youth. And he actually went to school and got a degree in physics. And also, he was a mechanical genius. And he designed all of these ideas, and a lot of the innovations in these engines were thought of by him, and he was blind. And so he worked with people, for instance, where if he wanted to read articles, he had people on his staff who would read the articles into a dictation machine and then give him the tapes, and he'd later listen to the tapes so he could keep up on whatever the latest state of the industry was. Everybody who dealt with him said the man was an absolute genius. And he was the guy who first said, yes, I think we can downsize a turbine engine and make it work. So then after they did that, Chrysler would experiment. And so, for instance, George Huebner realized that we want to get the word out about these things. So they would take these cars and drive them cross-country. And they drove one of these turbine cars cross-country from New York to LA. And along the way, every place they stopped, they got tons of free publicity. And so here is an article out of Popular Mechanics about the Chrysler turbine car driving cross-country. And it's a story written by George Huebner. At least it's bylined George Huebner. He may not have actually written it. And every single time they built a Chrysler turbine car, they would improve on it, find out what didn't work, what did work, and they'd improve upon it, come up with another generation. And they'd refer to the engines by the generations. So there's a first-generation engine, a second-generation engine. So here is a later model of a turbine car. This, I think, is the third generation. That is a turbine engine again back here. So think of a jet engine back here. And in case you're curious, these beer kegs here are air intakes. And the interesting thing about a turbine engine is how much air they use. And if you want to think about this, turbine engines are air-cooled. So the air going in goes and mixes with the fuel, and then the fuel ignites, and then the gases blast out the back. Comes out the back end hotter than it went in, but that's how the heat gets out of the engine. So the air intakes are gigantic, But you'll also notice they're facing at each other. And there's a reason for that. If you ever think about the noises that jet engines make, a lot of it, believe it or not, is made by the intake. And so Chrysler was trying to find out ways to make the engines quieter. And one of the things they did that with was doing that with the air intakes faced like that. And that was one of the experiments they were testing. So they then came out with the next generation turbine. And this is a 4th generation turbine. And this is the most commonly known Chrysler turbine car. They built a fleet of 55 of these cars. They were identical except for one. 54 of them were this color. And they decided to do a big publicity stunt. They took 55 of these cars and they actually dedicated 50 of them to a fleet that they would lend to the public. And they told people, if you want one, send us a postcard and tell us why. And we will let you have one for a couple months if we pick you. And they wound up lending these cars out to different families around the country. You'd get the car for a couple months. I interviewed families who had these cars. And they said that you'd get the car, they would show up at your house, they'd give you a quick walkthrough, but they'd also let the press know what was happening. So you'd show up with a whole press crew on your front yard, and they'd have the car, they'd show you how to operate it, and there'd often be stories in the newspaper. I found one in the Free Press News where it goes, Royal Oak banker gets turbine car. And there's a photograph of some banker on the front lawn of his house with a turbine car behind him, and he's got the keys. And so there's a Chrysler turbine car buried in there somewhere. And of course, they've got the hood pops. They can show people the engine. There's a bunch of funny things you could do with a Chrysler turbine car. For instance, with the engine idling, you could take a nickel on its side and stand it up on the engine and let go of it and stay there. That's how smooth they ran. They did demonstrations running on different fuels. They sent one of them on an around-the-world tour. So, for instance, in Mexico, they demonstrated it to the president, and they ran it on tequila. They brought it to Australia. They brought it to Paris. They brought it to mainland Europe. They brought it all over the place, England, and they were demonstrating these cars. And everywhere they went, people loved them. They're fascinated by them. They sound funny. They sound like big vacuum cleaners. They are not as loud as a jet that you'd think because they actually did work on making the engines quieter. But then when the program was over and all these people had driven the car, they then brought them all back in and they continued working, but the problem they had was the engines were extremely expensive. And I actually interviewed the guy who made the call that the engines were too expensive to build. And he contacted the guys who are building the engines and said, look, if we want to build these cars and sell them to the public, we need to know what the engine is going to cost. And they said, well, it's kind of tough to say because right now we're building these engines basically by hand and getting these parts in small batches. And they said, well, could you build the engines for $1,000 a piece if we mass produce them? They go, no, never, impossible. I said, okay, 5,000? No. 10,000? The guy goes, maybe. They go, okay, we can't sell them. Because back then you could grab a V8, like a 318 off the shelf for a couple $100, put it in a car and people will drive it. Who's going to spend $10,000 extra on an engine just because it runs on peanut oil? So it seemed like a weird novelty, but as a result of that, they couldn't sell them. So the experiments continued. Chrysler kept building more turbine cars. This is a later version. And the interesting thing is that at first, the multi-fuel capabilities of the turbine car were considered to be a novelty. And so the fact that it ran on VO5 hairspray, yeah, that's funny. But it's like, who cares? VO5 hairspray is more expensive than gasoline is. And so the idea of it being multi-fuel didn't occur to anybody until the OPEC oil crisis. And so when OPEC clamped down on importing oil to America, exporting oil to America, then suddenly people started looking for other alternative fuels or multi-fuel cars. And suddenly Chrysler was like, hey, we got one. Our turbine engine burns, and this right here is running on a mix of gasoline and methanol, another mix of alcohol, and then there's ethanol, something or other, non-leaded gasoline. But I spoke to guys from Chrysler who said we ran it on peanut oil. We do demonstrations on peanut oil, vegetable oil. We could run it on anything that burns. But the problem is, at that point, nobody really cared. So they continued the experiments all the way through 1978. That's the last generation turbine car. There is a turbine engine in that car. The reason there's a helicopter behind is I suspect the helicopter is also turbine powered. But at that point, Chrysler realized that they couldn't do it economically enough, and so they killed the program. But from beginning to end, they built something like 77 different turbine-powered cars. 55 of them were that car right there. They were almost identical. And there's a tragic story that people always talk about, that the engines were built in America, but the bodies were built in Italy by a company called Ghia. And hand-built bodies in Italy coming into America have to pay some kind of tariff when they come into the country, import tax. And you have a choice. You can either pay the full import duty, or if you promise to send it back out of the country or destroy it, you can pay a much smaller import duty. And they're shipping in 55 cars, so they decided to just pay the full duty on 10 of them and the lesser duty on the other 45. And they actually wound up destroying 46 of these cars at a junkyard. If you go onto YouTube and type in turbine car destruction, you'll see them with forklifts crushing these cars and then sticking them in a furnace and burning them. And it's a sad, sad story, because if you can get your hands on one of these cars today, 9 of them still exist, they're worth several $1 million a piece. So, and one of my claims to fame is I've driven 3 of them. So not many people can say that. If you want to see one of these cars, there's one at the Stahl Museum in New Baltimore. There's one at the Chrysler Archives in Auburn Hills. The Henry Ford's got one on display. There's a few out there, but it's sad because that could have been our cars we're driving today with jet engines in them.
Hey, Henry, thanks for waiting. I'm telling you, Henry, that's Steve Lehto, one interesting guy. I learned so much about cars. More than I ever knew. Henry, you like cars? Oh, I can tell your tongue is out of your mouth again. You know what, Henry? That makes me think of something. I'm a little bit hungry right now. Hey, let's head on over to Popeye's Chicken. I love that chicken sandwich they serve there. No, you got time. You're going to get home to the kids tonight. It's not a 3-hour wait for a Popeye's chicken sandwich. It's like an hour and a half. Let's head on over there. 19 Mile Road, Henry, let's go.